Hi, Kirby.
Hi, Bob.
How you doing?
I'm very good. How are you?
I'm okay. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright of Blogging His TV, and you are Kirby Ferguson. And you know, one thing I wondered as I prepared for this is, how do you introduce yourself? Like, if somebody says at a party, what do you do? What do you say?
I just say I'm a filmmaker.
Okay.
I think that's the easy answer.
And true.
Yes, it is.
But you've become known lately for a kind of unconventional work of film, right? A series of short videos called Everything is a Remix.
Right.
Which is a very arresting product, I've got to say.
Thanks a lot.
We'll link to it, and maybe, I don't know, if we get ambitious, we might splice a few little images in.
Cool.
But how would you? I'm curious. You know, the thing ends on a note about copyright protection, and you clearly are against overly restrictive copyright protection.
Right.
But is that, and we can get into how you know your project illustrates your message there. But is that how it actually started? Is that how your interest in the remix concept began, with that concern?
Right. Yeah, I think it did. I mean, I wanted to tackle it from a creative angle. Mm-hmm. But when it started, yeah, that was when it was back in 2007 or 2008 when I started thinking about it. And, like Lawrence Lessig was doing his thing, and there were a bunch of other documentaries that were about, copyleft stuff. So it was in the air. There were a lot of crazy lawsuits going on. But I felt that there was nothing that was about the creative aspect of it, and how, hey, this is kind of, what we all do. We're all kind of building new stuff out of old stuff. So I felt like, there was possibly some way to tell that story. And then, some of the examples cropped up over the next couple of years, probably. And, that's how it started. I did ultimately want to make that point, but I knew that I wanted to talk about creativity itself.
Okay. And what is leaving aside the copyright issue, well, I guess the answer to my question is everything is a remix. I was going to say, what's the thumbnail summary of what you're saying?
Yeah.
But you're saying, I mean, of course, remix is familiar particularly in the context of music.
Right.
But you're saying all of human creativity consists of taking pre-existing elements and mixing them up in a new way. Is that an oversimplification?
No, I think that's the gist of it. Yeah, I mean the chunks, like I describe it as copy, transform, and combine, and it is simple. Like those are big chunks. A lot of stuff can fit into those. But I think that is sort of how it breaks up, and how original your work is. I think is about how much you've combined into it and how much you've transformed what it is that you began with. But I mean, my theory is that all creativity is a form of remixing, I guess. Mm-hmm.
And the examples in your film series are from cinema, from music, from the things that I guess most lend themselves to illustration in this medium. But of course, you'd say the same about science, and in fact, you quote Isaac Newton's famous saying, I stand on the shoulders of giants, meaning that I have ripped people off, or I've adopted the ideas. And then you show that even that is a rip-off. Because who was it who actually first said, I stand on the shoulders of giants?
Bernard de Chartres.
Who knew?
Yeah, there you go.
But it applies to kind of all of these, all intellectual realms, you might say.
Yes.
But I mean, there are degrees of creativity, right? I mean,
yes.
Has this forced you to ask yourself, like, okay, who comes closest to really creating stuff almost out of nothing?
Right. I mean, I guess I don't feel that anybody truly does that. I mean, I've looked into the great geniuses. I'm not an authority on them, but I've looked into Picasso and Beethoven and figures like that. James Joyce, Shakespeare's blatantly fits. And it seems to apply to everybody. It's more about kind of the boldness of how you combine things, of how you build upon it, Frequently I think you're transforming yourself. You start with this base, and then you start adding your own twist to it, and then after a while, you're basically kind of remixing yourself after a while. But you did nonetheless start with other people's stuff. But can you think of anybody who seems to kind of summon stuff out of the blue?
In the realm of science, the way they frame the question sometimes is, had this person not lived, how long would it have taken for their theory to get discovered? And the candidate you often hear for that is Einstein. Right. People saying it might have been 50 years or something.
But didn't he say himself that he thought it probably would have come up, I thought he said within a decade or two, but probably out of multiple people.
Yeah, he might have. And he might have been being modest. But he's, there's certainly a lot of cases where, some of which you note, the people are just neck and neck. Alfred Wallace and Charles Darwin. The microprocessor was independently invented by two people. TV and so on. So this applies to all realms, you think, and all intellectual realms. And you actually, you draw a parallel. I'm not sure which of the 4 installments you do this in, but you draw this parallel to natural selection. Right. And you use the terminology of Richard Dawkins, the meme, right?
Yes, right, yeah.
Did that, in watching that, I kind of thought, well, maybe that was an epiphany moment for you.
Yeah, definitely, and it came from somebody else, honestly.
Everything does.
Yeah, exactly. But this one really, I didn't even discover it myself. Somebody emailed me and said, hey, do you know what you're talking about? Is basically evolution, natural selection. I was like, great. I kind of thought that I could go there at some point, but I didn't realize it lined up quite as well as it did. It was a bit of an epiphany, but that one, truly... I probably would have explored it, but somebody just flat out told me that hey, that's basically what you're talking about.
Mm-hmm. The idea that just as genes recombine to form kind of new things, these little bits and pieces of culture do, and that's the idea that had been drawn out by Richard Dawkins and others, and lots of anthropologists before him actually. So when you watch your videos and you see juxtapositions of strikingly similar things, I don't know, I think there's something from what the good, the bad, and the ugly scene is compares to what again? Is that that's not it's Star Wars,
that's
right?
True, yeah.
Star Wars. Now, you're not always suggesting that the person consciously took this,
no,
or even unconsciously, right?
That's true. Yeah, you can certainly sometimes you can just do the same thing unintentionally. It's like multiple discovery in science.
Right.
You both just happen to come up with the same thing. I think frequently it's buried. You don't know that you're doing it. I know that comedians do that a lot. That's common with stand-up comics. They don't know that they're, when they're just riffing on stage, they'll just blurt out somebody else's material because they've forgotten that it's not theirs. Certainly there's I'm not trying to prove that, George Lucas, in the case of George Lucas, that he's just sort of, going through films and snipping pieces and sticking them together. Although I do know that he did some of that too, like the special effects in Star Wars, and this is documented in this documentary called Empire of Dreams, and the special effects house talks about, they had these shots from these World War II war films, and that's what they modeled their special effects on.
So but in the one where you start with Raiders of the Lost, I guess it's Raiders of the Lost Ark, and then on the same screen next to it are a bunch of elements that coincide to different elements of Raiders of the Lost Ark.
No, I don't think that's me, actually.
Oh, that's not you?
No, that's somebody else's. I think I know what you're talking about, but I didn't do that.
Oh, you put it on your site.
Right.
You didn't put it in your... It's on your site, but in your thing. Okay,
right.
Okay.
Yeah, somebody else did that.
Right. I take that question.
I don't have the patience. He went through the whole film.
Well, but that's something else I was going to ask you about is, when I watch your stuff and you draw, from the entire history of like Hollywood and music to illustrate how often different elements reappear again and again.
Right.
I think either you have an encyclopedic knowledge of the history of culture, or there's a factory in China somewhere where you have 1,000 people poring over, or something in between the two. Yeah. But I mean, kind of seriously, how do you do this?
The latter is closer, honestly. The truth is that a lot of that stuff, when it comes to samples like that, the chunks that match up between different films, there's large and active communities out there that have looked into that stuff and worked it all out. So I basically just have to, check out these different communities. There is some stuff I found out on my own. But for the most part, the fans, it's large communities of fans that figure that stuff out. Conveying it visually was not easy, though.
Right, and you're very effective at that. It's very engrossing, and I was, in some cases I read the transcripts accompanying the video, and I thought, transcripts are fine, but it's amazing how much video transforms.
For sure.
How fundamental the visual is to video. I guess that's not a shocking statement when you put it that way, is it?
Right.
But this crowdsourcing business, now, do you mean that there are people who are actually, you're in communication with, who are responsive to your needs and are volunteering stuff for you? Or do you mean you just kind of eavesdrop on these communities and shamelessly rip them off?
It can be both. Commonly, I think to be a really good video remixer, it does help to have an encyclopedic memory of shots. I don't really have that. I just sort of remember, I think there was something like this in whatever film, and I have to go look it up, whereas I think other people can, they really remember what exactly the shot was. Sometimes I'll think I remember it, I go back and I look and it's not actually there.
Mm-hmm.
So I frequently ask my followers on Twitter if they, I say I'm looking for whatever shot. I did this with part 4. I need a shot of, an empty courtroom or something like that. And people will get back to me really quickly. People are really into it. They really enjoy, nerding out over this stuff. Mm-hmm. So I do have my Twitter followers, and I ask them questions when I'm looking for a specific shot. When it comes to the Star Wars and the Kill Bill stuff, Led Zeppelin, the kind of set pieces where I have to draw a lot of comparisons, that stuff is mostly through fan websites that I get the material.
Yeah, I hadn't realized how derivative Led Zeppelin was until I saw that.
Oh, really? Wow.
No, I didn't realize. Apparently, you say in the thing that they're famous for it.
Yeah.
And I guess, what I had heard, I guess I had the idea that the critique was more that this is just white boys blues than it was that they are literally going and taking specific, chord progressions and and stealing them, which apparently is the actual valid accusation.
Yeah, especially early on, they definitely made some dumb moves, I think, early on.
Stuff that they really should have credited in some.
For sure, yeah. I mean, it was clear that some of the stuff was by Willie Dixon or some of these other old blues guys, and everybody knew it, and they should have been upfront about it. I don't know why. I wish they would be more forthright about what exactly happened. I've looked into that. I've never heard them just say, we were just young and stupid and we screwed up or whatever. So they've never entirely copped to it. So
it's funny.
I'm not sure why they did it.
There is this instinct to always take credit for everything yourself, but it turns out that giving credit to other people is almost always actually good for you. Doesn't hurt you and often is actively good for you in my experience.
Is it?
Yeah, I think so. Well, I guess I guess usually when you're dealing with a relatively minor kind of insight anyway, if you say, as so-and-so has noted, that can incur in them a sense of reciprocal obligation. They're grateful that you've done it,
Sure.
So that's money in the bank.
Yeah.
And meanwhile, it was an illusion for you to ever think that it was so important, that the insight that somebody was, it was going to be engraved in your tombstone, and you were going to get really famous for it.
Right.
I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong.
So, like when I told you that, it's just fan communities that figure out all these film comparisons.
That was brilliant.
Your opinion of me didn't kind of like lower you. You didn't prefer the thought of me knowing all that stuff.
Well, I guess at one level my opinion of you rose because I thought, what a brilliant tactician. He's recurring this sense of reciprocal obligation in this entire community, in addition to projecting this almost certainly false sense of humility, which is good.
Right.
But on the downside, I thought he was a genius, and he's just not very smart.
Now he's just a web nerd, yeah.
Yeah,
he just knows how to Google.
So
I think that I would agree with that. I think it is ultimately better for you, but I think it can be a slower path. I think, in the short term, before people figure it out, it can make you look better, snagging people's stuff and pretending that it's yours.
I think that's probably true.
Right.
I'm trying to think of examples. In a lot of these fields, like Bob Dylan stole the chord progression for House of the Rising Sun from some guy who I once saw complain about it.
He didn't write House of the Rising Sun.
No, I know, but apparently what was distinctive was that this guy, I don't know music, but there was something distinctive about the chord progression this other guy had come up with. There was another guy hanging out in the village. I don't even know what chord progression means, but this is what the guy said.
He did that a lot, actually.
Oh, he was a total.
Yeah.
I think Bob Dylan was almost like an idiot savant. Like, he just repeated, I think he was the most complete remix artist ever.
Yeah, absolutely.
I don't think he even ever thought, what do the lyrics that I'm uttering mean? It was that they sounded like lyrics that had been, that someone else had, I don't know.
Right. Yeah, I think like there are people who were around him back in the day, and they sometimes described him as just this this vessel for like the culture at large. It's just sort of like he was channeling this energy of that moment, but he wasn't even you couldn't quite put your finger on exactly who he is and what his musical ideas are or whatever. But he was just sort of channeling this moment in time.
And that does not lower him in your esteem, right?
No, it does not.
It does not.
No.
But you are saying, in talking about Led Zeppelin, that there is some point, although in theory, in your worldview, everything we do almost should be, in some sense, credited to someone else, to exaggerate your point a little, but still,
yes.
You obviously can't go around putting an asterisk after every sentence you utter.
Yeah.
But still, you do think there's some line beyond which you're obliged to give credit.
I do, yeah, and that's where the real, that's where the rubber hits the road with this stuff. I mean, that's where it really gets. That's where you've got to make hard decisions, and where things are going to get messy sometimes. But yeah, I do think there's, I think it's about community standards, and I think music has that and had that then, with songwriting credits. There were certain established practices that everybody used, and they went against the grain. They didn't do it the way that other people were doing it. So I think it's, I think, communities coming together and agreeing on what is or isn't okay is the way to do it. I prefer that to the legislative route.
Okay, so on the legislative route,
right.
I'm not, just from watching the videos, I'm not sure what your specific position is on the fine points of copyright law. I mean, you definitely are cautioning us about the overly broad application of copyright law, and that it can be stifling. But what is your? Are you saying nothing? No intellectual property should be protected, or what?
No, I'm not. I just think it should be. I personally believe that it should be more like what it was. So when copyright began, Pardon me. It was, it was a very streamlined act that was, just supposed to protect you from being egregiously ripped off, basically. And it was super tight. Like, there was a famous case where somebody translated, I believe it was Uncle Tom's Cabin, and, they went to court over it, the publisher claiming, hey, you can't just translate our book. And I believe they lost that case because, the idea was, well, now other people who can't speak English can read it. So that's a gain for, you've contributed to society, and that's a good thing. So I'm not saying we should go that far with it necessarily, but it was very tight, so it didn't extend to things like 2-second samples, which literally happened. There was a 2-second sample used from an old funkadelic song in a song by a rap group called NWA. And they, there was an influential court decision that went down where they lost that case over a 2-second sample that was deep in the mix and, tweaked and stuff. It wasn't entirely recognizable anymore. So basically this thing is just it's bloated and bloated to the point where it doesn't even make sense. It's not really about, protecting your commercial interests anymore. It's about, trying to maximize your profits. And, it's almost like the principle has exceeded, what you're really practically trying to do. So I think it's just, it's bloated beyond the point where it makes sense. And I think, for in the realm of patents, there's software patents right now. There's a lot of crazy lawsuits going on. And software patents are something that I think should cease to exist because you're not really patenting the software. You're basically patenting kind of an outline of what the software would be, but you're not actually making something. You're not making something that works. You're saying, I have an idea for something that does whatever, that moves stuff from here to there, whatever. And it's just very, ambiguous what you're actually staking a claim to. So software patents are something that I think should go away. Copyright, I'd just like to see it contract. I'd like to see the terms get shorter. I'd like to see it not be applied so broadly.
Yeah, with patents, with software, I think maybe the way you put it, with software, it's a patent of what something would be like if it had been invented, rather than... Right. Yes. I mean, rather than what something that you've actually invented is.
That's
like.
Exactly it. Yeah. I mean, you could make predictions. You could think, I think in a few years that we're going to be able to do this. You outline it. You write a patent. A patent is not an invention. It's just a patent. It's just an outline of how something would work. You're not actually making it work. So yeah, it just does not make sense.
Yeah, now originally the idea was to incentivize actual creativity, I guess with both patent law and copyright law, right? The idea was to make sure that there was enough payoff from creation so that people would be incentivized to create.
Exactly, which is what I think we should get back to.
Yeah. So it's fine with you that people aren't allowed to just take my book and scan them in and sell electronic copies.
Yes.
You're fine with that. But you're not fine with things like, me taking a 40-second thing from The Wizard of Oz or something and putting it on YouTube and being sued. Well, here's a question. Does it matter whether I do something new with it creatively? In other words, if I just put a minute of The Wizard of Oz on YouTube, is that less okay than if I'm using it to illustrate a point that I explicitly make?
Yeah, I think doing something with it creatively, it matters. I do think that, when you're taking a small piece of something and redistributing like that, I certainly don't think that's a crime. I don't think we need to involve the law in something like that. Have infrastructure in place with these websites where the stuff can get taken down, and just kind of leave it at that. I don't see why anybody should get sued over something like that. And I don't think that happens much. But yeah, I think that if you apply your creativity to transforming something and trying to make a statement of some sort, even if you do it poorly, If it mostly just kind of is what it is, and you just sort of, did something really primitive on top of it, I think that counts as an effort, and I think it should be looked at differently. I think it should be looked at as a creative act, even if the result is not particularly creative.
Mm-hmm. And as a technical matter, often what we're talking about is the concept of fair use. Is that right?
Yes.
There is this idea that you can quote a certain amount of text, which is fair use.
Yes.
But to go too far is not fair, and they're trying to apply that in the realm of video. And I don't know where the current thinking about it stands. But, what strikes me as ironic is almost any fragment of a movie or a TV show. Mm-hmm. Okay, I guess I'd say two things. First of all, I guess there's two questions you could ask. One is it the case that because that fragment is out there, there are people who will watch that instead of your production, your entire production?
Right.
And I guess sometimes yes. Although maybe that means you should have done some editing with the production. Is that, do you think, a valid question?
Yes, I think if it guts what you're trying to do, I think that's a problem. I think it's easier to apply to music. If the sample that you take, it could be 5 seconds long, let's say. That doesn't sound like much, but that could be like the riff. That could be like the juicy part of the tune that the whole thing is built around. Mm-hmm. So it is possible that by taking a small bit, you are taking, the heart of the thing and, potentially capitalizing on it. I think with video, I would be surprised if a 30-second clip would be commercially damaging, or a minute or even 2 minutes or whatever. I mm-hmm. find it hard to believe that would be commercially damaging. I tend to think if people liked it, they might be more interested in checking out the whole thing.
Well, that's the irony, is that a lot of these things add commercial value in that sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And there are communities. There's a funny community that knows this that I've heard about, actually, and it's there's a realm online of specialty websites where you can see the nude scenes from movies, right? Mm. And the movie, the production companies, the distributors have basically just let this go on mm-hmm. Because they know that people are more likely to buy the film, to check out the film in some way if they've watched these little clips. Mm. So in some worlds that logic does hold up.
Yeah, although when I was 15, I would say the opposite applied.
You saw the clip, you were done.
I went to entire movies.
Right.
I sat through entire movies just for the sake of the 3-second scene, and if I could have just had that in isolation, I would have not gone to the trouble of sneaking into an R-rated movie.
I think the logic probably comes in that they never would have seen it to begin with.
Right.
You're getting exposed to people that otherwise wouldn't have known that the movie existed.
Right. It makes perfect sense. So back to your Twitter following. Is this and your use of it in a creative way? That is itself. It's interesting how that kind of illustrates your overall concept. Right. And it's interesting the way the technology of collaboration has developed over time, mm-hmm. such that the process you're describing is basically just happening faster and faster and more kind of vividly. Did your following develop largely as a result of this particular project?
Yes. Yeah, that my Twitter account didn't even exist until I launched the video. So yeah, it's completely about the video.
So I guess you must have a Twitter following that's particularly amenable to contributing things, since the worldview that drew them, that attracted them mm-hmm. to you, is all about contribution, which is good. And how did you? So what were you doing? So is this for you? This has been like a kind of a big thing, right?
Yes.
You just found the ground was fertile, and you started this what? How long ago? When did you start feeling that you were on to something here? That you were really, that there was an audience for this?
It was a year and a half ago that the first one came out. So I was working a full-time job at the time, and I thought like a job in video production. So I thought, doing a remix project where I'm, cutting other people's stuff together and not shooting original stuff would be easy. I thought I'm chopping together people's stuff. It'll be a good side project. Then, of course, it ended up taking a lot more time than I expected, but it also did a lot better than I expected. Like, basically, as soon as the first one came out, I don't know how many views it got, but, it found a large audience really quickly.
And let me be clear, originally, your decision was not just to do something that was a remix, right? It wasn't just to do remix as a creative medium, but originally, from the beginning, you said, I'm going to do something that is about that is remix that illustrates remix. Yes, yeah. I knew that remix would be a tool that I would use within telling the story. So the whole thing is not remixed by the traditional standard. I'm not always taking clips of music and splicing them together. But yeah, it's a tool that I use throughout. And what, you just put the first one on YouTube or what? Vimeo was where it started. Vimeo is, a little different audience from from something like YouTube. It's a better audience for me, so that's where I started. And it took off really quickly. And, I got more serious about the second one. The first one I did, maybe it took 2 or 3 months. It didn't take that long. Then the second one took more like 4 months, maybe even 5 months. And then they've slowly taken longer and longer since then. But at one point in there, I started doing public speaking and selling some merchandise and taking donations. And I realized at one point that I could just do this full time. So now it's become the heart of my freelance life. Wow. So you were kind of, before that, kind of laboring in obscurity, so to speak? I mean, you had a job in video production? That's right, yeah. Yeah, and marketing stuff, yeah. Okay. Are you still doing a job on the side? Nope, I just do this. And I noticed that you're funding your next project with Kickstarter, right? Correct. And which is this place where you fund things by getting people sufficiently interested in them to pledge, to say that they will give X amount of money, and it's an ironclad pledge, so long as there are enough other commitments to reach some threshold level, right? That's the way it works? Correct, yeah. You pick a target, you pick whatever, $2,000, let's say. And then, people make pledges and get rewards. So if you pledge $20, whatever, you get, whatever, a poster or something like that. And then but then you have to make that $2,000 threshold. And if you don't, then everybody gets their money back. Right. And had you used that with this project, or is this a new thing with the next project? No, that was just a new thing. Kickstarter wasn't as big when I started. Everything is a remix. And also, I didn't have that big of an audience back then. I doubt it would have worked all that great. But yeah, I knew that when I finished part 4, the last part of Everything is a Remix, that I would launch the next project off the back of Everything is a Remix part 4. Okay, so meanwhile, you're actually making a living off of what? Mainly public speaking, or? Commissions, public speaking, merchandise, donations, all of those, and now Kickstarter. Commissions for what? For video production for companies and nonprofits and stuff like that. Okay, but you don't mean commissions for playing these 4 videos, right? No, to make videos for them. So, for instance, I see. When the whole, the whole SOPA thing, right? The SOPA Pippa thing that went down. Right. So I made a very popular video for a group called Fight for the Future, and that was a commissioned gig. Okay, and SOPA, what was that? Stop Online Piracy Act? Yeah. The video we made was actually about something called Protect IP. Because SOPA hadn't actually dropped at that point. It didn't exist yet. But it still became, Protect IP did also, was also in Congress at the same time. And it sort of circulated to illustrate the story, even though it wasn't entirely applicable to the Stop Online Piracy Act. And that act was considered by many in the online community as kind of overreaching, and how the measures it took to protect intellectual property. And it seems to be pretty much dead now. Right?
Yep. I believe it will be back, personally.
Because there are powerful interests behind it.
Yeah, exactly. And it was, Protect IP before was, I forget, it had some other acronym. It was something else. It never got to Congress. It got shut down before then. Mm-hmm. But I tend to think, it'll get modified and it'll come back.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And so... So now you are, and just out of curiosity, what kinds of groups do you speak to for these?
With my public speaking?
With your public speaking, yeah.
I do plenty of conferences.
Uh-huh.
I'm starting to do. I have done some corporate stuff. I've done Google and Netflix.
Mm-hmm.
There might be more of that in the future. I do schools sometimes. I like doing schools.
Mm-hmm.
That's mostly the conferences, corporations, schools.
So in these tech circles, you're now kind of famous? Like you go to these conferences and people faint at the sight of you and stuff?
Exactly. That is exactly what happened. People just drop all over the place.
That's great. Congratulations.
Thanks. Yeah.
But you are really, right? It's like, oh, the remix guy, right?
Within a certain community, yeah, I'm fairly well known. Yeah, I have to admit, there's certain events that when I go to them, I know that I'll be known by quite a few people there.
Mm-hmm.
Which is a weird feeling. Not used to that.
But not a bad feeling.
No, it's very nice. It actually makes you behave better. You feel like,
really?
People are observing you, and, if you're rude to somebody or something, you think that it'll show up on Twitter or something like that.
So you were a bad person before you became famous in certain circles?
I was evil before.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. No, I think I was just I live in New York. You're not always thinking like that, You're not thinking about how you come off necessarily a lot of the time. Now I think about that more. I think it's influenced me in a good way, actually.
But what about the temptations of fame?
all the chicks and
groupies
drugs and stuff.
Groupies and drugs I was thinking of mainly. How's that working out?
It's rough. It's just...
well, you know
it takes moral fortitude, which I have.
It's hard to get sleep, too. It's hard to get enough sleep.
When you're cooked up all the time, you mean? Or?
That and the babes.
Exactly. Yes, it is. It's rough, but I've coped.
Since I started Blogging Heads, that's been my big challenge.
The chicks and the drugs, yeah.
And getting enough sleep at the same time. Yes.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I'm sure it's a bad magnet.
Oh man, you have no idea. No idea. So tell us about the next project that's going to be funded with Kickstarter.
The next project is a political series called This Is Not a Conspiracy Theory, and it will be a similar sort of approach as Everything is a Remix, but it will be original content this time. It won't be, there might be a little bit of remixing in it, but it won't be the heart of it. And basically the idea will be to pull back from current events and kind of show the larger shape of how we've gotten where we are right now. So it's very, the way I'm describing it now is very vague, but it's really early. I haven't written it yet. I'm just getting into the research right now. But the idea is to show something that is, to do something that's very large scale, covers, centuries of time, and, informs people about, why we believe some of the things that we believe. And I hope gives them some context for, why we are where we are right now.
So you mean centuries of political history?
All kinds of history, yeah. But, certainly, going back to the Revolution for sure. Going back to immigration, the original settlements, stuff like that. I think those will be explored pretty early on.
Okay. And, don't say any more than you want to say or can say, but do you want to elaborate on what this is, what is it? This is not a conspiracy theory?
That's right, yeah. Why is it called that?
Yeah.
Because I think, once you start pulling back like that and you start showing that this is connected to that and that's connected to this, then you're sort of getting into conspiracy-ish sort of territory. So I think I just wanted to address that right off the bat, but at the same time have it, it'd be kind of a loose enough title that I could go a lot of different directions within that. But that is why I called it that, because it will cover so much time and will connect things together that it might start to seem sort of conspiracy-ish. But I'm definitely not trying to show that,
The Freemasons. Will
I'm
the
not
Freemasons make an appearance?
Maybe they will, just for entertainment's sake. But I'm not trying to. There'll be no shadowy elites.
Okay, but I'm a little unclear on what it is. What it would be about your narrative that would even suggest that you were. What is it about connecting things up through time that makes people think you're suggesting a conspiracy?
I think it's more connecting events together that can sound like that.
When you're saying, was this a coincidence? Surely this is no coincidence, you mean?
Yeah, exactly. That sort of thing. So it's when you start stringing events together and illustrating that they are related, I think people can believe that there's some sort of intentionality to that, which is not what I'm trying to show.
I see. I can kind of see that.
That the row of dominoes after that was sort of, it was aimed by somebody at the beginning, when I'm just trying to show that, they just happen to be linked. It's not planned.
Yeah, I can see how if it has some of the texture of your current project, of everything as a remix, that would be suggested. And in fact, the same question as we mentioned earlier kind of arises with that. In other words, here's these two things that look very much alike.
Yes.
Are you saying that the person consciously adopted it? Well, not necessarily. So it's a little bit analogous to that question.
Yeah, totally.
Okay, I get it. Well, listen, having seen your current project, I'm optimistic about the next one.
Cool. Thanks, Bob.
And I encourage everybody to follow the links on our site and watch your current thing. Everything is a remix. 4 very kind of bite-sized chunks. None of them is going to take much out of your day. But they're very, very well done, very arresting. And congratulations on ripping off enough people to have created something interesting.
Thanks, Bob. Can I ask you questions now?
You can ask me as many as you want. Yeah, sure.
So you referred, maybe jokingly, in your email to your book, to your last book, as a remix of previous texts. So how did you mean that? Did you mean that, it's a synthesis kind of popularized? So I'm talking about the evolution of God.
Yeah.
Did you mean that it's kind of a popularizing work, or was it, sort of
I was kind of
humbleness?
I was just, without giving it much thought, trying to throw in everything as a remix joke into my email. But I think I was thinking more. I think I was thinking more about the scriptural texts themselves, actually.
Right. Yeah.
There's a lot of trying to explain scripture and throwing scripture in. So there's a certain amount of kind of chopping up the Bible and the Quran, so to speak, and replacing the things. But you know what I thought about today, actually, in preparation for this, was that the title of the book, The Evolution of God, could have been kind of the remix of God. In other words,
sure.
The book illustrates, leave aside the little joke I made in the email, the book illustrates cultural evolution at work in the context of belief in God, in a way that is very, very consistent with your worldview. You have these, elements. The Abrahamic God. Mm-hmm. When Yahweh shows up, I spend a lot of time, when he shows up, early first millennium BCE or whenever we think it was, talking about the different known gods that he seems really derived from. Mm-hmm. Takes a lot from a god named Ale and other elements from another god, and that's the way cultural evolution works. So, at the same time, the book itself is, there's not that many new ideas in it, and I try to attribute the ideas that are old, but, I stand on the shoulders of giants, you might say.
Right.
And an interesting question is, when does synthesis become distinctively new? But anyway, you were going to say something else? So
the Old Testament is literally different books that are chopped together, right? That's called the documentary. What's it called? Documentary.
Well, the documentary hypothesis is the argument that you can discern in much of the Old Testament kind of 4 distinct not individual people necessarily, but four sources. Like the P would be the priestly source.
Yeah.
Doesn't mean it was one priest, but it means that this was written perhaps in a particular period of time by particular people who had enough in common, like they were all members of the priestly class, to have a common point of view. But yeah, that's the documentary hypothesis, yes.
Okay, right. And then, but the New Testament is not like that?
I think much less so. I mean, first of all, the actual epistles of Paul are letters actually written by Paul, and then there are the fake, the ones that are thought to be fake epistles, but even they were presumably faked by a single person. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, now there is some real remix. I mean, those are not the names of the known authors, okay. and there's enough in common to many of them to suggest that, I mean, for example, Matthew and Luke, either the authors were reading Mark, which was the first one that was written, or they were, or they had access to a source that Mark had access to. You know, there is that degree of overlap, and yet there are also novel elements thrown in by each one.
Right.
But the New Testament, it's much clearer what's going on in the New Testament than the Old Testament is really, Old Testament scholarship is a real jungle, trying to figure out when things were written and how many hands were involved, and but it's very interesting trying to straighten out the story.
And can you recognize, in the Old Testament, can you recognize previous religions?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
I mean, you can, in some cases, like God will be described with a phrase like the rider on the clouds, and that'll turn out to be a phrase that was used by a different earlier God, and there's more reason than just the similarity of phrasing to suggest that that's not a coincidence.
Right.
The descriptions of Yahweh are often, in some cases, sound very much like a god named El that was in the area. I mean, that's probably, yes, what one God was Yahweh derived from more than any others. You'd probably say El, and not coincidentally, that word in Hebrew is the generic word for God, El. So,
and where did that God originate?
That was, I think, a north, you might say Canaanite, loosely speaking. In other words, the region that, according to the Bible, the Israelites conquered.
I see.
So, yeah, it's a total remix.
And then how does the Quran relate to them?
Well, clearly Muhammad, I mean, I'm taking doing a standard secular materialist interpretation. I'm not adopting the Muslim interpretation that everything Muhammad said was just imparted by God. I mean, if we assume that Muhammad was saying things that reflected what he had heard or learned or whatever, he must have had access to much of the Hebrew tradition and the Christian tradition, because he tells a lot of stories drawn from the Old Testament, a lot drawn from the New Testament, but he also tells some stories that are from apocryphal sources that didn't wind up being accepted in the Christian canon. So, like, he tells a story about Jesus, stories about miracles Jesus did as a boy, like he takes something clay and turns it into a real bird. That can be found in apocryphal Christian sources. So, Muhammad presumably had exposure to forms of Christianity that did not become accepted as Orthodox Christianity. But a lot of the Hebrew and Christian material that he seems to have had access to is mainstream.
I see.
But very much. I mean, the interesting thing about Muhammad is you realize in reading the Quran, especially if, like the Bible, the Quran does not appear in the order in which it actually was put down.
Okay.
And once you take our best guess about when stuff was put down, and you read the Quran that way, it's pretty clear he was trying to draw Christians and Jews and the people and the Muslim tradition into a common faith. He was very, originally, Muslims now pray toward Mecca. Well, originally he had them praying toward Jerusalem.
I see.
So it was very much like an ecumenical project that then did not succeed. It was, there may have been some Jews and Christians who signed on, but apparently not enough, because then there was ultimately antagonism between the faiths.
So what are the important books on that topic?
On the
evolution of God, on your topic.
Well, one comes to mind, but humility prevents me from repeating the title yet again.
I'll say it for you. Aside from your book,
on the Quran, I liked Michael Cook's stuff. I mean, he's also somebody I know at Princeton. I'll tell you I'd have to go back and look. I mean, in Christianity, I think Bart Ehrman's stuff is pretty solid, and easy. And he writes these accessible books on kind of what the actual story is about when books were written and so on, what parts are likely to be true and so on. He's very good on that. The Old Testament, it's harder to come up with a single source. And in the Quran, I would say it's harder as well.
Okay.
Michael Cook's stuff is germane, but there's no single source like there is that I'm aware of. But my book is very heavily footnoted.
Right. It's nice to hear you not able to just kind of summon a few names quickly or whatever, because I get that all the time. Like when people ask me about who I remixed, I always just kind of stall out like I don't quite know, because it's so many people that have been mashed together, it's hard for me to just say, oh, it's like, this guy.
Well, also, it's been a few years.
Right.
And and I'm not as young as I was. But
is your memory fading? Is that true?
Oh, 55 is different from 25. Yeah, I'm here to attest to that. Yeah, I don't mean, it's not like it just, I would say it's this. People start commenting on this in kind of late 40s.
Oh, really?
Yeah, but also it's been since I did the actual research. It's now been 3 or 4 years. But also it's just there is no single source. I mean, I did a lot of synthesis of a lot of different sources. Mm-hmm. Especially for the Old Testament and the Quran. So there's no single kind of
right.
And also my worldview is not that like most religious scholars aren't looking at it exactly the way I am. So, but I may be able to. Are you going to do work in this in religion?
Probably not. I thought about it and I started looking into it a bit. There might be somebody else that will make a video. Occasionally there's these supplement videos that other people make for me. There might be somebody else who's going to make one on that topic.
Huh. Well, I might be in touch for names in that realm. Okay. I would like. Come to think of it, I should do a video of the remix of God.
What? Can you say what you think? Do you like Karen Armstrong?
I do like Karen Armstrong. Her approach is very different than mine. Mm-hmm. Her treatment of Islam is I would say, a little politically correct.
Okay.
Well, she basically has the rule that she doesn't say anything about Islam that's not officially accepted by Muslims, whereas my rule was to say stuff about all of them that aren't accepted by the religious adherents.
Right.
She doesn't so much follow that rule with Judaism and Christianity, but I think it's reliable. She's much more focused on. She much more sees the evolution of ideas as almost this autonomous thing, whereas I'm always focusing on the material factors, economic, political, and so on, that gave rise to them.
Right.
Hers is more of an intellectual history, you might say.
I see.
But I used it,
Oh, did you? You
I looked at it, yeah. Yeah, I read her stuff. Yeah.
Right.
Quote.
Now, Nonzero has become a popular idea Was it you that helped tip it?
First of all, I want to say how flattering this is. This is like the Bob interview. I've been waiting my whole life for somebody to take me this seriously.
Really? I'm surprised it hasn't happened.
Well, certainly the idea of the non-zero sum game is, of course, a product of game theorists. It goes back to, I guess, the 30s or 40s, John von Neumann and Oscar Morgenstern, I think. It was becoming, when I wrote the book, I'm sure I did something to spread knowledge of zero sum and non-zero sum games, but game theory was being applied in more and more different fields. I mean, I think mine was the first and probably only, which may say something about the wisdom of doing it in the first place. Nobody else, but attempt to kind of apply it to history, to apply in a macroscopic way, so far as I know.
Right.
But it was one of those ideas that was legitimately and on its own merits getting more and more attention.
The idea of non-zero, or the idea of zero sum?
Well, I mean the idea of non-zero sum. The idea of looking at life in this kind of game theoretical way, of dividing interactions between humans or even between animals or other entities into the zero sum and the non-zero sum,
right?
And looking at the properties of those things,
right? So did you feel that you were channeling a body of work, or did you feel like you sort of discovered something?
I mean, I think there were things that, so far as I know, were kind of original. But certainly, broadly speaking, I was drawing on ideas about cultural evolution that preceded me. It's like you said, it's just a remix. There are things I could point to that, so far as I know, were original products of my synthesis, but it was a synthesis.
Right. All right, cool. I think that's all I've got.
Are those your remixes I hear in the background?
With the small children?
Yeah.
I think it's no, they're not.
No connection.
No, I live above daycare.
I see. So it's
every few hours they come out and make a racket.
It's a remix of a bunch of remixes.
It's other people's remixes, not mine. Yeah.
Okay. Well, listen. Thank you for the flattering interrogation there.
My pleasure. That was interesting.
And good luck with the next thing.
Thanks a lot, Bob.
And maybe I'll be in touch when I decide to do the video remix of God. But meanwhile, people should instead watch everything as a remix and stay tuned for This Is Not a Conspiracy Theory. So good luck with that.
Thanks a lot, Bob. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
All right, take care.
Okay, bye-bye.